teach in the Center for Liberal Education. I'm very happy to see you all today. I'm going to briefly introduce Dr. Davis, and then we will have the privilege of hearing from her. It is really a pleasure to welcome today Dr. Ellen Davis, who is the Amos, Ragan, Kearns Distinguished Professor of Bible and Practical Theology at Duke University Divinity School in North Carolina. Dr. Davis has received degrees from the University of California at Berkeley, Oxford University, the Church Divinity School of the Pacific, and Yale University. She has taught at Cambridge and Yale as well as at Duke, and has appeared on NPR and published op-eds related to environmental and food issues. In addition to delivering a great many talks and sermons and publishing numerous articles, Dr. Davis participates in interreligious Muslim-Christian dialogue sponsored by Archbishop Rowan Williams of the Anglican Communion. She is also the chair of an action-oriented panel that endeavors to improve theological education, agriculture, and community health in South Sudan. Among Dr. Davis's 8 books are Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture, an agrarian reading of the Bible, Wondrous Depth, Old Testament Preaching, and Who Are You, My Daughter? Reading Ruth through Image and Text. It is on account of Dr. Davis's work in Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture that I wished to bring her to Villanova. In this book, for which Dr. Davis's friend Wendell Berry wrote a foreword, Dr. Davis presents a sophisticated yet accessible discussion of how the Judeo-Christian scriptural tradition may function in conversation with late modern land use and ecological challenges. I am not the only scholar or concerned citizen who has found the book illuminating and inspiring, and I now give the floor to Dr. Davis so that you may hear something about why her work is considered so compelling. Please join me in giving the heartiest welcome to Dr. Ellen.
Thank you, Chara, and thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be here. Can people hear me in the back? Okay, good. Thank you. How long has it been since someone told you a story or read you a story? Too long. Nice. Okay. That is essentially what I'm going to do today. I'm going to read you the story of manna in the wilderness, Exodus chapter 16. But I also want to attune you to the way the Bible does theology. And the Bible does theology through great stories, stories that are crafted in exquisite detail. This story of manna in the wilderness is one of the root stories in the Bible. When I say it's a root story, I mean it is spiritually central for both Christians and Jews. In Christian tradition, give us this day our daily bread. The Lord's Prayer is reflecting upon the manna story. One might also say that the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, bread from heaven, is derived from the manna story or reflecting on the manna story. It's also central in Jewish tradition, and I'll say a bit more about that in a couple of minutes. Another reason I'm choosing to focus on this particular story is because I think it is pertinent to some of the most crucial concerns in our own culture. This is the story of manna in the wilderness is the second major story in the Bible about wise eating, about eating within certain God-given limits. Can anyone tell me off the top of your head what is the first story in the Bible that deals with eating within God-given limits or not? Exactly. Okay, the limits are set in chapter 2. The humans violate them in chapter 3. So, okay. This then, in a sense, picks up from there. The eating story continues. This is a key juncture in the Bible, 16th chapter of Exodus. It's always important to ask, where are we in the larger biblical narrative? Surprisingly, it's a question that we tend not to ask. We're fairly atomistic when we read the Bible. We focus on one little story at a time. But it's important to keep the big picture in mind. This is the 16th chapter of Exodus. This is a stretch, but does anyone happen to know what happens in the 15th chapter of Exodus, apart from you, Ruth, and you? Okay. Anyone under the age of 25 know what happened in the 14th and 15th chapters of Exodus? They crossed the Red Sea, okay? So this is the first story of the Israelites thoroughly outside of Egypt. Egypt left behind Pharaoh's army dead on the shores of the Red Sea. The first story, putting this positively, this is the first story of Israel in freedom. The first time these former slaves are in a position to make their own cultural determinations. Okay? Israel is a family in Genesis. In Exodus, for the first time, Israel is called an a people, a nation. Okay? And the first, one of the very first, I would say the first, cultural determination that any society needs to make is this: how are we going to eat? How are we going to secure the food supply? And food security has at least two elements to it. Every place and time, food security of a society has at least two elements in it. One, that there should be enough food so everyone can eat. Okay. If a culture doesn't work that one out so that everyone can eat, then it is unjust at the most basic level. So, working out eating so everyone can eat is the first element of food security. The second one is eating in such a way that our eating now does not damage the food supply for the future. So you might say the second crucial element of food security is economic permanence. If a culture does not work that out, then it is on its way out of business sooner or later. Okay. This matter of a cultural fit with our own concerns is the main reason I wanted to read this story with you today, to see if it yields any wisdom for our own time, any wisdom about food security, about food economics, and just to stimulate your thinking about how. Would you all who are seated in the back, there's plenty of room in the front, would you like to come down? No? Okay, fine, okay. So, it's just like church, no one sits in the front. All right. So, just to sort of stimulate your thinking about how the story might point forward to the future, I'm going to share with you an interesting saying from the Jewish tradition. About this story. It is a saying from the first Jewish commentary on Exodus, and I think on any book from the 2nd century, the Mechilta. And the rabbis say this: the Torah, the great teaching from Sinai, Torah was not given except to the eaters of manna. Torah, the teaching from Sinai, was not given except to the eaters of manna. Okay, they don't explain that, they just say it. Okay. So, in some way, participating in the manna economy, and I'll tell you in a minute what I mean by that, participating in the manna economy in the wilderness, I'll tell you what I mean by it now. When I speak of a manna economy, the word economy, it comes from two Greek words meaning the law of the household. Okay? And the Bible conceives, one way the Bible conceives of us is as God's household. So, Torah was not given except to the eaters of manna. In some way, this manna economy in the wilderness is preparing Israel for what's going to happen at Sinai, 4 chapters down the road. We're in Exodus 16 now. The revelation at Sinai is given beginning in chapter 20 of Exodus. And manna is providing in some way the material base for Israel to receive that divine revelation. In a sense, what the rabbis mean when they say Torah was not given except to the eaters of manna, what they mean is something like, if you can't get this, if you can't get what God is doing now with the manna, then you're not going to get anything else God says or does. You might as well stop reading right here. Okay. All right. So let's see what kind of wisdom might be available to eaters of manna and to us through them. I'm going to start reading this story, and as I read it, I want you to sort of begin noticing details. And details, one, what's it telling us about God? What's it telling us about theology, about God? And two, what's it telling us about ourselves in the presence of God? Koram Deo, Lifnei Elohim. What is it telling us about who we are? You might call that religious anthropology. All right. And you have a translation of Exodus 16 in front of you. I've chosen for you Everett Fox's, I think, wonderful translation of Exodus 16 for a couple of reasons. The less important reason is because I suspect it's an unfamiliar translation and it will sound fresh to you. The more significant reason is that Everett Fox's translation is the closest I can show you to what it is to read the Bible in Hebrew. Everett Fox's translation is so transparent to the Hebrew that most of the time I can back translate from his English into the Hebrew. Okay. And just one more point before I start reading, and that is that where you see YHWH, the so-called unpronounceable name of God, the sacred name of God, I'm going to read Lord, which is the convention in many Christian translations. Okay, so I'm going to start reading. I'll get about a third of the way through, and then I'm going to stop and point some stuff out to you. They moved on from Elim, and they came, the entire community of the children of Israel, to the wilderness of Tzin, which is between Elim and Sinai. In the 15th day after the new moon, after they're going out from the land of Egypt, and they grumbled. The entire community of the children of Israel against Moshe, that's Moses, and against Aharon, Aaron, in the wilderness. The children of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt when we sat by the flesh pots, when we ate bread until we were, I would say, stuffed. For you have brought us into this wilderness to bring death on this whole assembly by starvation." The Lord said to Moshe, "Here, I will make rain down upon you bread from the heavens. And the people shall go out and glean each day's amount in its day, in order that I may test them, whether they will walk according to my instruction, is the translation here, the Hebrew words Torah, whether they will walk according to my Torah or not. But it shall be on the 6th day, when they prepare what they have brought in, it shall be a double portion compared to what they glean day after day." Moshe and Aharon said to the children of Israel, "At sunset you will know that it is the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. At daybreak you will see the glory of the Lord when he hearkens to your grumblings against the Lord. What are we that you grumble against us?" Moshe said, "Since the Lord gives you flesh to eat at sunset and at daybreak bread to satisfy yourselves, Since the Lord hearkens to your grumblings, which you grumble against him, what are we? Not against us are your grumblings, but against the Lord. Moshe said to Aharon, say to the entire community of the children of Israel, come near in the presence of the Lord, for he has hearkened to your grumblings. Now it was, when Aharon spoke to the entire community of the children of Israel, they faced the wilderness, and here the glory of the Lord could be seen in the cloud. It's actually the first time in the Bible that this phrase, the glory of the Lord, which is the visible presence of God, it's the first time that Israel encounters it. The glory of the Lord could be seen in the cloud. The Lord spoke to Moshe, saying, I have hearkened to the grumblings of the children of Israel. Speak to them and say, between the setting times, that means at twilight, you shall eat flesh, and at daybreak you shall be satisfied with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. Okay. I'm just going to point out a few things I noticed to kind of get this warmed up, and then I'm going to read the rest and ask what you notice. All right. Verse 1. This story takes place beginning on the 15th day after the new moon, after they're going out from the land of Egypt. So they are, 6 weeks into this 40-year journey in the wilderness. 6 weeks. They are poised between Egypt and Sinai, not just geographically, but mentally, emotionally, even spiritually. Listen to their grumble. Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord, I'm in verse 3 now, in Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, and when we ate bread until we were stuffed. But you have brought us into this wilderness to bring death to this whole assembly by starvation. Okay, let's dwell on that memory for a minute. You might call it their belly memory. Their bellies are still back in Egypt, sitting beside those flesh pots, eating bread until they are stuffed. Okay. We sat by the flesh pots, eating bread. They spoke the truth there. That's an accurate memory. Who's eating the meat in the flesh pots, do you suppose? They're slaves. Slaves in Egypt ate bread and beer. Okay? That's enough for the slaves. Who do you suppose is eating the flesh in the pots, the meat? Speak, for your servant attends. Egyptians, the overseers. Okay, the slave drivers, exactly. Okay, so we sat by the flesh pots eating our fill of bread. That part of the memory is accurate, but what else is it they said? Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord when we were still in Egypt. That phrase, the hand of the Lord, occurs a lot in the book of Exodus. Can anybody remember or imagine what the hand of the Lord does in the book of Exodus? Yes. The plagues, okay. And also, God brings them out of Egypt with, and can anyone finish that sentence? Brought them out of Egypt with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. Does this ring any bells? Okay, a phrase that occurs multiple times when they cross the Red Sea. At the beginning, before they cross, they look back and they see the Egyptians coming and they're really scared. And then the sea opens and they cross. This is chapter 14 of Exodus. And on the other side, they see what the hand of the Lord had done, and they were really scared. Okay, because this was more than they knew how to take in. But now, so the saving hand of God, they are now remembering as, or imagining as, a killing hand and wish it had killed them off. From God's perspective, for which I dare to speak at this point, from God's perspective, That has got to hurt. I mean, God has just brought them out of Egypt with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, and now they wish that God's hand had killed them off when they were still sitting by those flesh pots. That is perfect ingratitude. Okay. If I were God, I would get them for that. But the divine response is surprisingly mild, even generous. So verse 4, the Lord said to Moses, "Here, I will make rain down upon you bread from the heavens." Those of you who go to Mass, it's a phrase that's familiar. It is at least in my tradition. Bread from heaven. Okay, "I will make rain down upon you bread from the heavens, and the people shall go out and glean, each day's amount in its day, in order that I may test them whether they will walk according to my Torah or not." So let me just pick out a few things from that one verse that I think are important for understanding this whole story. Okay, so they may go out and glean. Glean is actually a word that occurs 7 times in this story. It is 7 as a number of completeness, of perfection in the Bible. It marks something that we are meant to pay careful attention to. So the word isn't the ordinary word for harvest or for gathering stuff. It is specifically the word for gleaning, like at the edges of the fields, what's left after the harvest. Who are the gleaners in the Bible? Who gleans? Anyone know? Is it rich people? Is it landowners? Okay, so we know who it's not. So who's left? Okay, it's the poor, it's the widows, it's the orphans, it's the landless, okay? So all of Israel at this point is being put in the posture of the landless, okay? And they're going to stay there for 40 years. All right. Let's continue on with that line. So that I'll make it rain down bread from the heavens. The people shall go out and glean, each day's amount in its day. Okay. Now, I don't expect you to hear this, but this is an echo from an earlier part of Exodus. But you know enough of the story that you might be able to guess, even if you don't remember. Each day's amount in its day. Can you imagine who might have said that to the Israelites when they were back in Egypt? What were the Israelites doing in Egypt? Go for it.
When they increased the amount of material, but
Yes, exactly. Okay. Pharaoh's henchmen, when Pharaoh has taken away the straw, remember, and you still have to make the same amount of bricks, each day's amount in its day. Okay? Exactly that same phrase. And remember, the Bible is written in an oral culture, okay? Where when you hear something, an unusual phrase, it begins to set, your head's kind of like an echo chamber, and you begin to think, where have I heard this before? And you connect it. Okay, so this is important, because the last time Israel heard this, it was Pharaoh's overseers saying, finish your jobs, each day's amount in its day, just like when you had straw to put into your bricks. Now, when they hear God's directions through Moses to glean each day's amount of manna in its day, what we're able to see, at least putting these two things together in the narrative, is that God is the un-Pharaoh. Okay? In Egypt, food seemed to come from Pharaoh. In Egypt, Pharaoh was directing Israel's social economy, the ordering of its household. Now God is directing them to a totally different kind of economy, the manna economy. And just to underscore again the significance of this moment, that last line of verse 4, in order that I may test them whether they will walk according to my Torah or not. This is the litmus test for Israel, whether they can function as God's household, God's intimates, or not. Okay. So, two rules before we read on, just to highlight one point. Two rules to this household. You've just heard them here. Each family head gleans just enough for one day, each enough for this day. Give us this day our daily bread. Okay, so first rule is, you might call it the rule of sufficiency. Okay? Second rule of this economy is collect double on the sixth day and get it all prepared, because nobody's going to be going out on the sixth day. When we read the rest of this story, you'll understand why those two rules make sense. And I want to note just one more thing before we move on, and that is that there is a promise here that if Israel keeps these rules, abides by this manna economy, they will not only be physically satisfied, as they were in Egypt, sitting by those flesh pots eating bread till they were stuffed, at least that's how they remember it. They will not only be physically satisfied, but if they eat in this way, it will be for them a revelatory experience. So listen again to verse 12, which is where we stopped. Say to them, between the setting times at twilight you shall eat flesh, and at daybreak you shall be satisfied with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. Okay, so eating in some way will be revelatory for Israel. Israel definitely, the Bible definitely does not have a body-soul dichotomy, okay? What you know in your body is what you know about God very often. Okay, so I'm going to read on now. I'm going to read the rest of the story, and I'm just going to ask you at the end if anything pops out for you. It's no right thing to pop out. I'm just curious to see what you might hear. All right. Now it was at sunset. A herd of quail came up and covered the camp, and at daybreak there was a layer of dew around the camp. And when the layer of dew went up, here upon the surface of the wilderness, something fine, scaly, fine as hoarfrost upon the land. When the children of Israel saw it, they said, each man to his brother, Manhu, that's Hebrew, what is it? For they did not know what it was. Moshe said to them, it is the bread that the Lord has given you for eating. This is the word that the Lord has commanded. Glean from it, that word again, each man according to what he can eat. An omer, that's a measure, we'll get back to it. An omer per capita, per head, according to the number of your persons, each man for those in his tent you are to take. The children of Israel did this. They gleaned, the one more and the one less, but when they measured by the omer, no surplus had the one more, and the one less had no shortage. Each man had gleaned according to what he could eat. Moshe said to them, no man shall leave any of it until morning. But they did not hearken to Moshe, and some people left some of it until morning. It became wormy with maggots and reeked. And Moshe became furious with them. They gleaned it in the morning, every morning, each man in accordance with what he could eat. And when the sun heated up, it melted. Now it was on the sixth day that they gleaned a double portion of bread, 2 omers for each one. All the exalted leaders of the community came and told it to Moshe. He said to them, it is what the Lord spoke about. Tomorrow is a Sabbath, ceasing, a Sabbath of holiness for the Lord. Whatever you wish to bake, bake, and whatever you wish to boil, boil. And all the surplus put aside for yourselves in safekeeping until morning. They put it aside until morning as Moshe had commanded, and it did not reek, neither were there any maggots in it. Moshe said, eat it today, for today is a Sabbath for the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. For 6 days you are to glean, but on the 7th day is Sabbath. There will not be any on it. But it was on the seventh day that some of the people went out to glean, and they did not find. The Lord said to Moshe, until when will y'all, that's a plural in Hebrew, until when will y'all refuse to keep my commandments and my instructions, my Torah? You see that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Stay each man in his spot. No man shall go out from his place on the seventh day. So the people ceased on the seventh day. Now the house of Israel called its name Man. That was that manhu. What is it? That's what they call it. We call it manna in English. Okay. It is, in sort of English, it is like coriander seed, whitish, and its taste is like a wafer with honey. Moshe said, this is the word that the Lord has commanded, an omer of it for safekeeping throughout your generations, in order that they may see the bread that I had you eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt. Moshe said to Aharon, take a vat and put an omer of man in it, and put it aside in the presence of the Lord in safekeeping throughout your generations. As the Lord had commanded Moshe, Aharon put it before the testimony. That's in the Ark of the Covenant, like the inner part of the tabernacle, okay? And though we don't have the tabernacle yet, but that's where it's going to go, in safekeeping. And the children of Israel ate the man for the 40 years until they came to settled land. The man they ate until they came to the edge of the land of Canaan. Now an omer, in case you were wondering, it's 1/10 of an ephah. Okay. Did you notice anything in there? There's no right answer. I'm just kind of curious. Anything pop out? Yes?
The one thing that popped out to me was they actually used currency. Like, I don't know if it's the right interpretation, but I thought that omer and ephah was an actual currency that they were talking about. So.
Fabulous, fabulous. They're actually, there's a wonderful teaching of a contemporary rabbi, Micha Odenheimer. This is the only place in Torah where you actually get the conversion of the volumes. This is not monetary currency, but of course this is not a monetary economy. This is a goods economy. And this is the key to the measuring system. And as Micha Odenheimer says, it reminds us to keep actual human need as the basis for all our calculations. We actually know how much they needed to sustain life in the wilderness. Anything else stand out for you? Yes?
I find it very interesting that when the people began to live life with balance and go through their food with moderation is when they became successful.
Okay. Well, you might also say, how do you define success there? Because that's an important question.
Able to sustain life.
Okay, able to sustain life. And what's more, how it's also the moment at which they become religiously insightful. You shall know that I am the Lord, which from a biblical perspective defines success. Okay, good, excellent point. Yes?
I thought it was interesting that dew or water came before the manna came.
Okay. Any thought why that's interesting?
I don't know, just because water a lot of times is the basis of life and sustainability.
Okay, excellent. Okay. In a sense, it's kind of the crop rising up from the ground, and water makes in the arid land of Sinai and the semi-arid land at which they're going to inhabit in Canaan, water makes all the difference between life and not life. So, okay. I can perceive that I am almost out of time. Shall I keep talking? Okay, then I'm just going to run through this briefly. Okay, and then we'll talk a bit more. So let's go back. You've done a great job. Thank you. Let's go back now to those 2 food rules. Each family had gleans just enough for each day. The point is, manna has 0 shelf life. Okay? It can't be stored, it rots, it stinks, it gets worms. As I was working on this lecture, I pulled Michael Pollan's wonderful book, Food Rules, off my shelf. And his food rule, Michael Pollan, who wrote Omnivore's Dilemma, maybe rings some bells with some folks. His food rule number 13 is eat only foods that will eventually rot. Okay? His point is real food is alive, and it can die if you keep it long enough. The point in the biblical story is related to that, but it's actually somewhat different. The reason manna cannot be stored, at least this is what I infer is the reason manna cannot be stored is because the manna economy is, as I said to you before, the total opposite of the food economy in Egypt. Anybody know what Israelites were building? You know that they were making those bricks, they were building stuff. Anyone know what they were building? And it's not pyramids. Anyone remember what they were building? What'd you say? No, they're building buildings. Storage facilities, exactly. They're building Pharaoh's store cities. What gets stored in Pharaoh's store cities? Grain, exactly. The grain that pours down the Nile. Pharaoh is the titular owner of all the land of Egypt, and as you know, in Egypt you can only grow food within a very narrow belt right along the Nile, and all of that grain is coming down the Nile into Pharaoh's storage cities, Ramses and Pithom, which the Israelites are building. Okay, so, and then, and you'll see this in Genesis, and then the food gets distributed by Pharaoh and his henchmen, like Joseph at one point. So it seemed in Egypt that food came from Pharaoh. Would that we died by the hand of the Lord when we were sitting by those flesh pots eating bread to our fill. But manna is bread from heaven. And that's why Moses gets so angry when some of the people try to save it. Because the Israelite tent is not supposed to be a storage place like Ramses and Pithom. It is the opposite image of Pharaoh's store cities. You can't keep it. You have to trust God to give it to you day by day. You might say that from a human perspective, give them a break. They were slaves. They controlled nothing in their lives. They're out in the middle of the wilderness. This is not a place where there's a lot of food. You would have thought that Moses could be a bit more compassionate. But the point is that they and the readers of the story are learning to look at the world from divine perspective. And from that perspective, food always and everywhere comes from God. Second food rule in our story reinforces that message. On Friday, the sixth day, they're to go out, collect double, cook it up, because no one's going out manna gleaning on Sabbath, on Saturday. It is Shabbat, Shabbaton, total Sabbath, holy to the Lord. And now I think we're getting closer to that question. Remember at the beginning I cited that saying from the second century rabbis, Torah was not given except to the eaters of manna. I think we're beginning to get a sense of how these things line up. This is the first time actually that Israel is told to observe Sabbath. They haven't yet received the Sabbath commandment. They're going to receive that at Sinai. The Sabbath commandment is the longest of the 10 commandments. It's also the most frequently repeated of the 10 commandments. So one could argue that it's the most important of the commandments. They haven't got the commandment yet, but you might say here they're beginning to learn how to keep Sabbath inductively by by walking through it before they learn the rule. And what is the point of Sabbath according to the 10 commandments in Exodus? I'm going to read you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, And he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and sanctified it. For on 6 days he made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that is in it. So, the Sabbath is a memorial of creation. And Moses says, on the 6th day, you stay in your tents. You don't go anywhere. This is time to chill with God, you might say, to share God's downtime. With whom do you share your downtime? With your professors? Maybe not. With people you're really close to? Okay, exactly. So this is a time to enjoy intimacy with God and to remember that this God who invites us into intimacy on the Sabbath is the very same God who created heaven and earth. Okay. So those are the two rules. As we have seen, some people don't get it. They go out on the Sabbath to glean, and at that point, God really loses it. It's the first time, I think, in Torah, in the Bible, that God really, really loses patience with the whole people of Israel and says, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my instructions? You see that God has given you the Sabbath 2 days, so stay put. Israel cannot, the message here is, Israel cannot keep Torah, it cannot be God's household unless it knows how to stop. Unless it knows how to get off the treadmill and honor God as creator of all that is. And again, that is the exact opposite of Egypt. The iron furnace, as Deuteronomy calls Egypt, the iron furnace that never stops burning until it burns up the slaves that keep it stoked, until the land of Egypt itself is destroyed by devastating plagues, the plagues that are Egypt's decreation story. Let me just say that Pharaoh's Egypt is presented, it is the fullest picture of tyranny we have in the Bible. Pharaoh's Egypt is something like the Third Reich of the Bible. It is the amazing industrial killing machine that ultimately self-destructs because it is running directly against the grain of the universe. That's Pharaoh's Egypt. Okay. The second rule is the second rule not to go out on Sabbath, stay in your tents. The rule is meant to slow Israel down. Again, I'm thinking of Michael Pollan's food rules. His rule number 49 is eat slowly, eat at a table, not in your car. Those rules, Michael Pollan, slow us down as individuals. But the bigger problem in our culture, as it was in Egypt, is the whole food economy. Like the iron furnace of Egypt, we have an economic system that does not know how to stop, does not know how to discern limits. Industrialism, including industrial food production, burns until it destroys the workforce, until it pollutes and destroys the land, soil, water, air, all those components of what we might call land, until it pollutes and destroys that in one place, and then it moves on to destroy them in another. So in Michael Pollan's food rules, number 27 is eat animals that have themselves eaten well. In other words, animals that are not factory farmed, not grown in confined animal feeding operations. And his food rule number 30 is eat well-grown food from healthy soil. I might add, and I said this to some of you if you were in the class I met with earlier today, eat food grown by people who expect their children and their grandchildren to eat off the same land, because they will farm it for permanence, for long-term food security and not for a quick profit. So now we see why why Sabbath is the most often reiterated commandment. It has to be reiterated so often because it's so easy to forget or to set aside when it violates our economic interest as we construe that in a very narrow way. So the point is that Sabbath is not just a day off. Sabbath is, as the Bible presents it to us, and above all in this story, Sabbath is an economic principle. It is a fundamental statement of value and of trust. As a statement of value, Sabbath is an assertion that the world is not just a heap of natural resources. It's not just a store city to be drawn down by whatever pharaoh happens to be in charge at the moment. The world is the work of God's hands. That's what Sabbath is as a way of valuing all that is. As an expression of trust, Sabbath is remembering that God can be trusted to provide what we need to live if we live within the limits of the world that God has created. So I think of my friend and colleague Norman Wurzbach in his wonderful book, Living the Sabbath, which is about the whole Sabbath economy. And Norman Wurzbach grew up in a German farming community in southern Alberta. And he talks about the fact that when he was a kid, and Alberta, as you know, has a pretty harsh climate, and when in the fall, at the time of the autumn harvest, when a storm was coming in and the grain was not yet harvested and it was Sunday, they went to church. They didn't go out into the fields. They stayed home, each one in their place. He said, it simply was not a decision we had to make. That decision was embedded in our community. We stayed home and we trusted that God would provide what we needed to live. Now that farming community has been subsumed by industrial scale agriculture, he said that doesn't happen anymore. It's farming 7 days a week. So Sabbath is an economic principle of value and trust. So these two principles then of the manna economy: everyone eats enough and not too much. Everyone knows that food comes from God and not from Pharaoh. One more question that we must ask: how do we know that these principles are for all time? Everyone eats enough and not too much. Everyone knows food comes from God. How do we know these are not just rules for the in-between time, between Canaan and Egypt and Canaan in the wilderness? And the answer to that comes at the very end of our story, in verse 32, when God commands that an omer of this man, this what is it, an omer of it be put for safekeeping throughout your generations. It's actually put in the holy place before the covenant. This manna kept in the holy place will keep not just for one day, but for all generations. There is an Israeli writer of the early 20th century, Achad Ha'am. His name means one of the people. And he has a wonderful saying. He says, it's not that Israel keeps Sabbath. It's that Sabbath keeps the people Israel. Okay. Sabbath makes the household of God what it is. The omer of manna keeps, but the point is that the Sabbath economy keeps Israel as God's household throughout your generations, as our story says. Okay, that's it. We've got 7 minutes. Great, okay. Comments? Thank you. Yes. It was just a stray hand. Comments, questions, places this takes you in your thinking. Was it too fast? Did you get what I was doing? Did it seem clear enough? What do you think about this way of reading a biblical story? Is it new to you, or is this how you've been accustomed to reading? Yeah.
I have a question about your personal opinions on these kinds of biblical readings. I was just curious as to if you believe or take these stories as being 100% literal or partly metaphorical.
As I said to you, I probably wouldn't use the word, I probably wouldn't choose either one of those words, literal or metaphorical, to talk about it. But what I would say is, what I said at the beginning, the way, I think those terms reflect the way people in the modern period do theology. I think they don't reflect the way that the biblical writers and most of the people in pre-modern periods do theology. And as I say, I mean, when we do theology, we tend to write an essay, and we write a bunch of footnotes, okay? And we make a bunch of historical claims or philosophical claims, and we prove an argument. That's not the way the Bible does theology. And so I told you to think at the beginning, what does it say about God? What does it say about us as believers in the presence of God? And the Bible does that by telling stories that are true. Are they, could you... There was actually a wonderful Roman historian who said of the way stories tell truth, he said they're not about something that happened once. They're about things that happen over and over and over again. And I think that's a rather useful way of thinking about how the Bible stories are true. So I think I'm sort of answering your question, but I'm not answering it in the terms of literal or metaphorical, because those terms don't express what I want to express. If the question is, do I think it's true? Yes, in the sense that it's something that happens over and over and over again. So that may be enough for this moment. Yes?
I wonder if you help me answer a more personal question about biblical text outside of Exodus.
Give it a shot.
Genesis 6:19. It's when God is speaking to Noah and commanding him how he should build his ark. He tells him to says, "You shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark." And then later in Genesis 7, he says, "Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, and then also a pair of unclean." And I was wondering what happened there as far as going from 2 to 7, and then also if you're destroying the earth, why you would, to get rid of what is not pure, then why you would take an unclean animal with you onto the ark.
Okay, excellent. First, I'm going to answer them in reverse order. Clean and unclean animals, these are ritual designations between what can be sacrificed and what cannot be sacrificed. This is not the same kind of issue for which God determined to send the flood, which was that the whole earth had ruined its way upon earth, and the earth was filled with Hamas, with violence. Okay, so those are moral. That's a kind of moral degradation, which is different from the clean and the unclean animals. Okay, is that clear? Okay. The number thing it's a very astute observation, and the flood story is one of the key stories that has been used to explore what I think most biblical scholars, including myself, would now think, which is that Genesis and a lot of a number of the 5 books of Moses, certainly Genesis and Exodus, they don't come from a single hand. They are, if you look carefully, you'll see that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 differ slightly in detail, what comes in what order, for instance, in creation. And so there's a wonderful phrase, I think, from one of my teachers, Robert Alter, speaks about the compositional intelligence that informs the Bible. It comes together as a whole, but it does not come from a single hand or a single strand of tradition. You mentioned that I teach, you mentioned that I often teach in Sudan. I teach in South Sudan each summer. And a couple of summers ago, I was working with the first chapters of Genesis. And as I say, there's some differences between the first and the second chapter, and they noticed this. And I said, and this is often, in our culture, this is often a real point of anxiety for people to think that the Bible might come from more than one hand, or that the 5 books of Moses might come from more than one hand. But I had Sudanese from a number of different tribes in the room, and I said, and I thought, how am I going to explain biblical criticism to them, modern biblical criticism, something that most of them don't have the kind of educational backgrounds that you have. How's this going to fly? And I said, pointing to somebody, I said, I bet the Zandi tribe have a creation story. And they said, yeah. And I said, and I bet the Shilluk have a creation story. I said, yeah. And I said, and I bet they're not exactly the same. And the Nuer have one. And just naming the different people, tribes of people in the room. And the Kakwa have one, and so on. And they're not all identical. And yet, they fit together they fit together in certain ways. And if you brought them together, they would look something like Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And they said, well, yeah. Next problem? So it's a bit like that. Okay. Yes?
Something we were talking about in our class was Leviticus 19:23. It says, when you enter the land and plant any kind of fruit tree, regard its tree as forbidden. For 3 years you are to consider it as forbidden and must not be eaten. And we were wondering kind of what the significance of those 3 years was.
It's a very interesting question to which there are multiple answers given. We're in Leviticus 19:23, am I right? And yeah, it's actually, this is one of those cases. Let me ask what translation you're reading? Okay, this is one of those cases, and I wouldn't expect anybody's translation to have this, but it's a fascinating thing that the word that's actually used there is to, and I'm looking to see what this translation has. It's JPS. It also has forbidden. But the actual word there is uncircumcised. Okay? So it's interesting. It's a human word that is it's a word that normally applies to a human being, not to a tree. And so, in a sense, the question that's being asked, as I would understand it, by using that human word, as you know, circumcision marks the entry of an Israelite male into the community. Okay? So in a sense, a question that's being posed there is, when does the tree enter into the community? And Leviticus doesn't draw as neat a distinction between humans and non-humans as one might expect. In my book, Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture, actually my favorite chapter was the one I wrote on Leviticus, because it's analogous ways of thinking. How is a farmer, I'm going to get to your question, but I kind of have to, I can't get there quickly, okay? How is the farmer like the field? Well, they both have corners. They both have, the word that's used in Hebrew is peot, corners. And you can't trim the corner of the field or of the farmer's head. You have to leave it. You leave it for the gleaners if it's a field, but the farmer in some way stands for his field. And so in this way, the tree is being brought into the community at a certain point. Now, and you perhaps have another answer for this, but I've asked people who farm about this, and I've heard a number of people who say, my grandfather, we'd plant a tree, he would not let us pick the fruit for 3 years, 5 years, something like that, because the tree had to nourish itself. So we'd let the fruit fall to the ground and nourish the soil. So it was protecting it in its youth. That's the main thing I've heard. Did you want to add anything to that? Okay. So anyway, but in some ways, the very most interesting thing about that verse is that the tree, the question is when you can circumcise it. So it's a few minutes past 5.
Do we have other questions?
Yes.
Do you think, back to Exodus,
Okay.
do you think that there is any way to extrapolate from this story above our relationship to food?
Yes.
To policies and Christian identified universities when they have dining services, they provide their community with food.
Right. I don't think it's an easy thing. But I mean, I wouldn't have written a book on food systems and how I think the Bible invites us into a conversation about food production if I didn't think it were possible. And also if I did not think it is necessary. We are all of us, probably all of us, certainly I am, all of us complicit in a food system that is not sustainable. Again, to cite Wes Jackson, the good news is we won't be eating this way 50 years from now. The bad news is we won't be eating this way 50 years from now. We will not have the resources to eat this way 50 years from now. Right now we have a window of time to make some changes. And the window will get smaller. And as we make bad choices, we bring that, we reduce our options. So I think we have to be having that conversation. I'll say at my own university, the green dining services, they haven't taken over the whole thing, but the most popular eating services at Duke are the green dining services. Mainly because the food is really good. And so it is. So I know it can be done. It probably has to be done a step at a time. And some of those steps are big steps. I mean, I was astonished. With this I'll end. One of my doctoral students came to me when we were creating a new building at the Divinity School and building a new building at the Divinity School, and there was going to be a food service in it. And we knew that it was going to wind up being something like Chick-fil-A or whatever. And one of my doctoral students came to me and said, I really want to make a pitch to the university for opening a green dining service. And I said, I've got other stuff to do. I don't have time to work on that. And she said, fine, I'll work on it. And so Sarah, who's much more charming than I am, went and found herself sitting next to the president's wife on one side and the head of the physical plant at Duke on the other, and said, I think we ought to start a green dining service. And sure enough, in a few months, we hadn't started a green dining service. So that was a huge beginning step that nobody expected would have happened. So it can happen. I can say of my own university that if students initiate something, it is far more likely to happen than if faculty initiate something, because you all are the folks that the university is proud of and is advertising your achievements and is saying, you know, this is what our students are doing. Duke has a major Duke University greening initiative, and it was launched by 2 sophomores in a public policy class who wrote a paper and asked the question, why is Duke continuing to build buildings? And we build a lot of buildings. They say that the Duke bird is the crane. So they said, why is Duke continuing to build buildings that are not LEED certified, like this building evidently is? And the public policy professor said, I don't know. Let's go ask Tolman Trask over in the, let's go ask the head of, let's go ask people at the head of physical plant services. And he said, I don't know. Let's go ask the vice provost. He said, I don't know. Let's go ask the president. And the president said, let's ask the board of trustees. And by the end of that year, the university had decided it would not build any more buildings that were not LEED certified. That happened from a student paper written in fall semester, and at its May meeting, the university made that decision and has abided by it. That wouldn't have happened if Ellen Davis had said, gee, why are we doing this? Go write a book, shut up, but when the students asked, it was different. So, okay. Thank you all.